So, Jason, thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to me today and to the people at the University of Waterloo. Primarily, this will be for the students at Waterloo and the courses that I teach, but I'm sure it's going to be of interest more broadly because of the guidance that it's going to provide on teaching more effectively, I hope, or certainly around how we use technology. But I thought I'd start just by asking you about your background and experience. You've been involved in online education for a number of years. You're working on your PhD in this area. So I thought I'd just ask you to give me a bit of background on what you do and where you're coming from.
Thanks, Peter. So yes, I have an experience with online education as a researcher. So I'm a doctoral candidate in the Doctorate of Education and Distance Education program at Athabasca University. I'm also an online faculty member at the University of Alberta's Graduate School of Library and Information Studies. And then I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning at Medicine Hat College. So I see online education holistically from a researcher perspective, from an online faculty member, and then as a developer who helps faculty convert and move towards online education. So as a doctoral candidate, I've been analyzing and mapping how online education and professional development for specifically part-time online instructors is represented or not represented in academic strategy documents. That was phase one. And then phase two has been interviews with directors and teaching and learning centers in Canada over the past year. And these interviews with teaching and learning center directors has been very therapeutic for me to kind of capture this important story. In March 2020, teaching and learning centers and educational development units suddenly became frontline workers in a great and mighty effort to keep the core business of their educational institutions operating. And we expanded our reach. As one director told me, just before the pandemic began, I told our leadership, this institution is about to discover that it has a teaching and learning center. And this expanded reach and this newfound importance has been wonderful, but it's also taken its toll. And then I also teach leadership and management principles at the University of Alberta's Graduate School of Library and Information Studies. And I designed and developed this course using everything I know about good teaching practice in online learning environments. And the course emphasizes learner capacity to prepare managers for the complexities of leading modern organizations. And the course enables learner autonomy within a collaborative learning environment that stresses the learner generation of content to provide evidence of learning. And these learners are, for the most part, mature working professionals. And then my primary role, I mentioned, is the Director of Teaching and Learning at Medicine Hat College, where I lead the team responsible for sustaining a focus on high quality instruction through the integration of educational technology with effective teaching practice. So working at that intersection of technology and pedagogy. So that's a brief overview of my experience and background.
And I think that's very appropriate, and it's going to be very valuable in informing the things that we're going to talk about today. And thank you. I wanted to get in touch with you when I saw your article in the Canadian Journal of Learning and Technology, and it discussed online learning in traditional institutions during the pandemic. So it was right up to date. There isn't a lot written about this yet, and so it was good to find it. But one of your arguments there was that most of the online learning that's happened so far has been of low quality for many reasons, and that higher quality online learning was possible. And so I was keen that you explain this.
Sure. I'd like to do two things. First is I'm going to point out the signifiers over the past year that led me to the argument that most of what has happened over the past year has been low quality instruction. And then I want to change my tune a little bit towards the end, because you know that when you're writing an article on a time sensitive nature like the pandemic, the time that you write it to the time that it gets published, you've got to make some decisions, right? So did I want to publish this in University Affairs or Inside Higher Ed, or something that perhaps has a shorter lifespan? But I thought my argument was longer lasting than that. And so I wrote this towards the beginning of the pandemic. I wrote it over the summer, right after, when I finally had a chance to breathe after we'd prepared for the emergency shift in winter and then spring. And then I had a couple, and then I started to really think about that. And people have dogged online education for years, and sometimes with very good reason. And I want to point to three signifiers. I want to take a look at students. I'd like to take a look at faculty, and then like to take a look at teaching and learning center directors. So, first of all, students. Shortly before we started this call, you were mentioning a meeting that you were in yesterday, where you were looking at student satisfaction. And a large majority of Ontario university students felt that the COVID-19 pandemic had a overall negative impact on both the quality of education and their general educational experience. The numbers were high, like 62, 76% of students. I can't remember the exact number, but it was really high. They felt that online learning had negatively impacted the quality of their education in Ontario. So much so that some students started to say, like, I want a refund, or don't charge me as much as you're going to charge me in a regular course. In the United States, we started to see some student associations initiate lawsuits, and that happens more frequently in the United States than Canada. But so, and then there's another dimension to this, right? So students overall said that it was negative. But then there's a more negative impact on students of color. And in Canada, there was a study about Indigenous students who, were already at a disadvantage, and they were very concerned about their participation in online learning. So many students argued that the abrupt switch to online courses after the outbreak took a large toll on their academic experiences. And online education has been known to have a higher negative effect on low income students, students with lower levels of academic preparation, mature students, and males, what some people are calling the new majority of students. So for students in general, it was bad. And then for specific cases with at-risk students, students of color, Indigenous students, it was even worse. So that's students. Faculty, in that same study from the Ontario Council of University Faculty Association, 76% of faculty felt that the online education was an inferior experience. So mirroring exactly what students had experienced, faculty felt the same way. And faculty critics raised questions about whether or not online learning actually increases inequities, particularly for those in poverty in remote regions or within specific socioeconomic or ethnic groups. So very similar to what we were experiencing with students, faculty felt the same way. And and then faculty were experiencing widespread burnout. So it was exhausting. There's an emotional toll that we have to talk about when we talk about teaching online in the and there's no way that emotional affective experience didn't spill into the teaching and learning environment. And then finally, educational developers. The educational developers, they can look under the hood of teaching and learning transactions they can look under the hood in courses. And what educational developers were seeing was a lot of low quality courses. When they looked under the hood, some of what they saw was incredibly shocking. I'm just going to share one quote here with one of the directors that I interviewed over the past year, because what they saw was so shocking that they felt impelled to take action. They said, we're not the course police. We don't want to be the ones scrutinizing programs and courses. We don't do this for face-to-face courses. But when we see inconsistencies in syllabi, or that the instructor is not engaged, they're not following the advice for how to be online, they're just posting PowerPoints, someone has got to do something. We've had some quality assurance processes in course and program development, but not in delivery. I don't want faculty to see me in the judgment corner, but in order to give students the best experience, there has to be a standard way of doing things. So who's going to champion this? And then they said, I will champion this, but I'll do it carefully. So students, faculty, and educational developers all saw that there were some struggles, right? So that's what led me to believe that it was low quality. So now I want to kind of change course a little bit, because some studies, so that's the narrative that the last past year has been absolutely horrible. There's an emerging narrative that maybe things weren't all that bad, So here's going to be me dismantling my own argument a little bit. Richard Aram has not always been kind to post-secondary education. I don't know if you've read his book, Academically Adrift, but a short article that he wrote in the New York Times is called Your So-Called Education. And what he documented is that a huge proportion of students in the United States demonstrated absolutely no learning gain from their first year to their fourth year. But many still had a grade point average of 3.4, which gave them a false sense of their progress and their capability. So, quite critical. But as he's studying students during the pandemic, his work seems to suggest that students have been working pretty hard. And as recently pointed out, where he was quoted in an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, he says, when you move to more engaging, participatory, interactive instructional strategies, student academic engagement goes up. And so I think this is one of the big lessons of the pandemic, and I think these two narratives kind of going right side by side one another, both might be true to some extent, you know. And so many colleges over the past year invested heavily in professional development over the spring and the summer to help faculty members create good online versions of their courses. You know, instructors transitioned away from 3-hour lecture courses to short, engaging videos, to using more formative assessments, fewer high stakes exams. You know, online proctoring over the past year has been one of the major battlegrounds. And they've encouraged group discussion and collaboration and flexibility to accommodate students who've been challenged by online learning in the pandemic. And I think this investment has started to pay off. You know, at my institution, we looked at the Steady Eddie, our student satisfaction survey. Results have always been high, but it was an earthquake. It was an earthquake. The numbers, as you were saying right before we started, the satisfaction numbers dropped precipitously. But then, if you look closely, about 2/3 of them would prefer to continue remote online, would prefer to continue remote learning in some capacity. And this seems to indicate that this is happening in a broader sense too. You know, Alex Usher from the Higher Education Strategy Associates recently suggested that 200 to 400,000 Canadian students might be more open to taking remote education as a permanent part of their education. So based on these numbers, my argument that a lot of online learning was of low quality may have been initially right, but we might not be able to say the same thing now, even just a year later. You know, now I would say that what we've experienced is that faculty are expert learners. They care deeply about their students and they wanted to learn how to do this well. Students are incredibly adaptable and they appreciated the flexibility provided by online learning. And teaching and learning centers on the whole knew what they were talking about and provided solid advice to faculty for the development of online courses. So I still think interactivity, authenticity, and support remain important challenges for online learning education to grow and mature and fulfill its potential and promise. But I'm starting to rethink the assertion that a lot of it or most of it was of low quality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think what you're saying is that at first, people struggled, but then as time has passed and we've gained more experience, and there's been more time for people to mature in their use of online learning, that things may have improved.
Yep.
And at the same time, that for learners, their experience has not been completely negative. You seem to also be saying that that there's quite a widespread desire to have online elements continue in some way. You're not saying exactly what way that will be, but the idea of some form or some elements of online being there is maybe positive.
Yeah.
Okay. Mine, then, to continue on this idea of low quality, I was interested in what you had to say. One of your three main themes was interactivity. And I know that some of the people who are watching this are likely to be concerned about their own level of interactivity with their students as they work online. So I thought I'd ask you about how we could achieve higher levels of interactivity in online learning.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways to answer this question. One of the ways that I would answer this question is that in online education, the idea of regulatory frameworks and quality assurance standards have always been more comfortable than in face-to-face teaching. And so one of the ways to think about it would be to have very clear expectations about what kinds of interactivity should be expected, whether it's an asynchronous course or a synchronous course. You know, when can students expect to get a response via email? What kinds of interactions are they going to have with their faculty member, and what interactions are they going to have with students, so that they can make an educated choice when they go into that environment. So perhaps, perhaps regulating some amount of what kind of interactivity should be taking place. But let's leave that aside, because I mean, I think that that's the most contentious, that's going to be the most difficult, and it's probably going to be the less rewarding. But some other ways to think about it is to talk about student maturity, faculty preparation, and then introductory college courses, especially. You know, student maturity plays a major role. You know, are students mature and are they ready to interact? Do they know how to interact in an online environment? You know, multidisciplinary study. I think it's the largest of its kind in Washington State, where they studied 40,000 courses and over 500,000 students. What they discovered was a learning gap between online courses and face-to-face courses for every student subgroup, but again, most pronounced for males, students of color, older students, and students with lower levels of academic preparation. Because students adapt from face-to-face to online learning environments. And when they don't have the immediacy of an instructor in front of them, a lot of responsibility is placed on the student. So do they actually have these skills? Do they know how to interact? So I think front loading some student instruction about what does interactivity and what's the role of the student, how does that take place? And so we start to see a lot of institutions doing that learning to learn online, and is learning ready for me? And I think that there's a way to help develop that learner maturity right at the very beginning, so that they can monitor their own learning. The other way to think about it is to rethink what is teaching. Going back to that low quality versus high quality. Low quality is characterized by a lot of content delivery. And I like to think about the two different meanings of the word delivery. Delivery in this case means handing over a piece of content. So think pizza delivery. That's the way we use the word, pizza delivery. Using technology to deliver content in an educational setting is just like pizza delivery by drone. That's all we're doing. It's oversimplistic to characterize it this way, but this is early undergraduate courses, which are content heavy, where the tyranny of content kind of crowds out everything else. And a lot of institutions have part-time faculty that teach these introductory courses. This can be problematic. So if we're taking, students adapting to higher education in these content heavy introductory courses, and then we add on to that the impact of part-time faculty, this can be very problematic. It's been said that faculty working conditions are student learning conditions. And I think that's really true. While not all part-time faculty are precariously employed, some are. And the experience of precarious employment impacts the learning environment, just like the faculty affective, their emotional state affects the learning environment. So how are those faculty prepared to build interactive teaching and learning experiences? So if students aren't ready to participate online and faculty don't build in those interactive experiences, we're not going to see a lot of interactivity. So once a certain amount of student maturity has been established and faculty are prepared, I think the ability to create interactive opportunities is almost endless. My favorite quote about teaching goes something like this. What's the best form of teaching? Well, it depends. It depends on the students. It depends on their maturity. It depends on the discipline. It depends on the teacher. It depends on so many different things. But the next best answer is students teaching other students. And so I think peer instruction and peer assessment are two of my favorite tools. I use them heavily in the course I teach. Collaborative learning is another one of the strategies that you employed. You talk about that. So collaborative learning is another one students sometimes hate. But in my 20 plus years of leadership, a lot of strategic work gets done in small teams, and case competitions are another form of collaborative learning in business. There's journaling or micro journaling on Twitter using some social media networks, so this requires a discussion of open spaces versus closed spaces, and whether or not the classroom, whether that's a physical classroom, an online classroom, is a public space or a private space, involving presentations by external experts to watch some of the student presentations. These are just a few of the common strategies that we promote and we see faculty use successfully. And there's tons of articles out there on the kinds of tips and tricks for making more interactive, but those are just a few suggestions.
And I think those are going to be very helpful to the people watching. But basically what you're saying is that an online environment can be quite rich from an interactive point of view. It is possible to have very good interaction online.
It's very possible. I mean, there's so many studies. I mean, this has probably been the key focus, for much of online education, especially within the community of inquiry model, really looking at social presence, like how do you establish those connections between students, and then teaching presence, how do you establish those connections with the faculty members. So much research has been done in there. There's been so many studies that show that it can be done really well. Like I said, there's countless ways to build interactivity into the course.
Wonderful. And so that then leads me to my next question, which was the second area that you focused on inside your article, where you talked about the online experience needing to emphasize, or that it emphasized the need for authentic assessment. And I was keen that you, first of all, explain what it is and how it might be achieved. And with that, perhaps to consider the concerns that many traditional faculty have about cheating online.
Sure. I think authentic assessments can help address faculty concerns, but they can't eliminate them. The late Tracy Bertag has shown pretty clearly, I think, that students can cheat or hire someone to cheat for them on every form of assessment. But some forms of assessment are less likely to be cheated on. I think in this morning's Academica Top 10, someone's talking about using the vitae, using students to express how they came to their answer. Those things can be really rich because then you can see whether or not you can, that talk aloud strategy, students can really express themselves and you can see their thought process as a way to verify that those are sometimes more consuming, time consuming for faculty to grade, but I think they can. There's a big reason that I'd like to talk about this. It comes down to faculty workload, and that becomes like, using that vitae, for example, so teaching and learning can be scalable to a certain degree, but assessment is some of the hardest work of teaching, and assessment isn't as scalable, I would say, as some teaching and learning activities. So, you can do recorded lectures, peer instruction assignments, peer assessment, that's scalable to a certain degree, but assessment isn't scalable. Like if I want to have a vitae with my 60 students, like that's going to take much more time than perhaps a collaborative assignment. So I think the best conception of authentic assessment comes from Reeves, Harrington, and Oliver. Authentic assessment begins with a task that must have real-world relevance. This is essential. Authentic means that the activity has to be as close as possible to what a student would do and experience in the world of work after the completion of their studies. So authentic and authentic assessment means creating a task or performance that's as close to the discipline or the profession that they're going into. So Gulliker's, Bastians, and Kirchner go a little bit further, and they develop this 5-dimensional framework for authentic assessment. I won't talk about them in great detail, but I'll just mention them. The first is physical context. So what's the physical context? Where are we working? And so much work now is team-based, it's geographically distant, it's technologically mediated. So, but some other environments are far more physically bound. So administering morphine to someone who's fallen off a ladder, pouring a suspended concrete slab, working with, in our power engineering program, working with boilers and steam. There's sometimes where the physical context really dictates authenticity. But then there's social context, and social context is what are the relationships, what are the roles, what are the roles and relationships that exist in a work environment? What are the power dynamics? Are these going to be short-term relationships, long-term relationships? All of that needs to be thought about when thinking about an authentic assessment. It has to produce a quality product that students would be asked to produce in real life. So, a business case, a trend analysis, an academic poster presentation. Those are just some of the assignments that we've seen that allow learners to demonstrate what they're doing in a way that permits the instructor to make valid inferences that they've mastered the underlying competencies. And much like the workplace, like I mentioned that, that stress on the vitae, students should defend their work to others to ensure that their apparent mastery is genuine. And so they have to develop polished products. And the 5th dimension is criteria and standards. This is where rubrics come into play because frequently employees know the criteria by which they'll be judged. This isn't always the case, but there are many times, frequently, performance management expectations, well-defined competencies, well-defined deliverables. So for fairness, it's important for teachers to set criteria and make them explicit to students. So I think that those can help, and I think that they can help with cheating because researchers have found that students who admit to cheating perceive their classroom environment to be less personalized, less involving, less cohesive, less satisfying, less task-oriented, and less individualized. So if that's what helps students, if that's what helps their justification to cheat, how do we make them more personalized, more involving, more cohesive, more task-oriented, more individualized? Well, I think authentic assessments can certainly help in that regard.
So authentic assessments really, the concept really challenges teachers today to look at the assessment that's being done and identify the extent to which it is authentically assessing the knowledge and skills that people may be gaining for the environments in which they're going to be applying them. And that's very important. But and it would seem, and something that many teachers have not really thought that much about.
Yeah, I just did a session at the University of Peradeniya in Sri Lanka, and they hadn't been thinking about that as well. And we've seen over the pandemic, some institutions take the step to say you have to find alternative assessments to final exams because they're concerned about online proctoring, they're concerned about surveillance, they're concerned about that. And so some institutions have created assessment specialists. Like I said, provosts sending messages that exams can only be issued in certain environments. And there are some places where exams are just a concrete reality. And I hope I pointed that out in the article as well. There are certain fields like the NCLEX in nursing. Like if you don't pass the exam, you don't get to practice professionally. So exams are still going to be around, but whenever possible, if you can move towards alternative forms of assessment, that's a great thing. And again, what this is a struggle for some places. And again, I come back to those introductory courses, really rethinking those introductory courses that are so content heavy, because people will say, like, especially in those content heavy introductory courses, how do I build authentic assessments into that? And that's an area that I'm exploring. And I don't think that there are necessarily any easy answers to that, but there are certainly ways to make any assessment strategy within any type of course more authentic, if authenticity is kind of seen as an ideal that we in a learning environment will never perfectly achieve, but it's something that we can move towards.
And you did say in your article that exams were still necessary in a number of areas. I remember that area clearly. My next question is around the relationship between teachers and students in an online environment. It's often argued that relationship online is weaker than in a classroom. You suggest that faculty are less comfortable online and are unsure about that relationship and what the boundaries and rules for that, I guess, might be. So I would value your thoughts on how online faculty-student relationships can be strengthened.
Sure. I'm going to answer this question in a couple ways, three ways. I think the first way is to say that faculty have really carefully constructed, negotiated boundaries to their teaching and learning environment when they're in face-to-face environments, and those have to be rebuilt in an online environment. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to answer the question in a really kind of strange and controversial way, and I may get stoned. I may get stoned for what I'm about to say, but first, I don't think it's any secret that some faculty like to be the center of attention. To use an oft used expression from instructor-centered to student-centered instruction, that transformational shift from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side, it's a huge shift in power dynamics. It's a fundamental rethinking of the 3-hour lecture course. And that's controversial, but I think we have to ask this question, what if relationships aren't all that important? Or how do we create more meaningful and important relationships? I think those are really important questions. So I'll take the first one. What if relationships aren't important? Some studies suggest that there's not actually a strong indication that students need a personal connection with the instructor. And rather, some of the literature demonstrates that students enter the online world, especially because it's suitable for independent learners. It offers a delivery format that's convenient, flexible, autonomous, and self-directed. It's accessible to them. So students in one of these studies, they found that students didn't find importance in the synchronous communications or being able to see or hear their instructors. So it really depends on the course. Another one of the studies that I looked at investigated why students leave online learning. Of the top 10 reasons that students listed, only one was related to the instructor and the teaching style. Many of the other reasons were personal, all of the other reasons. So within this study, there was minimal evidence that demonstrated that creating a greater sense of teaching presence in the online classroom was an effective use of the instructor's time and efforts. So, what if the relationship's not important? This is tough for some faculty to hear, and it's hard for me to even say it out loud. But I think that this is where some of the discomfort comes from. Terry Anderson, one of the big giants in online learning, wrote about this tension, back in 2002, that some learning outcomes are best taught in a community of learning, but some learners want to move at their own pace. So there's this tension between a controlled learning environment and giving some of that control, freedom, and power over to students. So there's a tension between how someone thinks a course ought to be taught and how a student might want to learn. And this takes us squarely to instructional design and the whole idea of course organization, which has implications for productive effort online. But now, having said that, what if relationships aren't that important? Let's go the other way. And once we've said that, like, how do we create more meaningful relationships between, like, how do we intentionally build strong relationships? Let's say that they're important. Let's actually say that faculty student interaction is crucial. Let's say it's essential. Then every object in the learning process needs to be seen as part of building that relationship and part of building a meaningful relationship with students. And I'm going to speak in personal terms that highlight, sound practice in online teaching. I think the relationship starts in the syllabus. So in my syllabus this year, I talked about how the pandemic impacted me personally and how this semester, based on all the evidence that I was looking at, could be filled with disruption and trauma. I wanted to open the door to students to reach out to me, to feel comfortable, to say that, I need help. I'm having difficulty, and that happened several times over the semester where students reached out and they said, like, look, I'm in lockdown with my 2-year-old and my 5-year-old. I'm having a difficult time keeping up with the readings, keeping up with the assignments, keeping up with the discussion. I need some flexibility. Well, okay, we can do that. They reached out to me. They felt comfortable reaching out to me in that way. So the syllabus helped set the tone for the caring and motivation that I wanted them to experience in this course. The syllabus also acknowledged that they were here because they care and they're motivated by the mission of libraries, archives, and museums so much that they were going to make the most of this opportunity, and that if they applied themselves, the course could transform their understanding of what leadership was, and that it really asked them to bring their whole self to the community. When I provide, one of the things I do is I provide strategic planning facilitation to community nonprofits like the Canadian Mental Health Association and the Medicine Hat Police Service. I use appreciative inquiry, and appreciative inquiry is an unapologetically positive look at things, and I tried to build that positive psychology into my syllabus. Beyond that, provide a really good introduction. Provide a brief video syllabus. Provide an introduction. I provided an introduction with pictures of me, my family, some of my favorite places. Then during the first week, I established community and connection by responding to every student's interaction in the introductory week. My wife knows that week is going to be busy. Like, I'm not going to be available at night because I'm reading and I'm responding to all of the students. It's incredibly time consuming, but I feel like it's really essential to give them a personal welcome. And all of these things take time, so I'm conscious of that. I also tell students to be aggressive, to be assertive, to reach out to me. They don't all take me up on it, but some do. And I've written letters of recommendation for students where I feel like I know them as well as I could know them if I did everything, in a face-to-face environment. But the other thing that I like to do is provide short 2 to 3 minute video feedbacks on their assignments, along with all of the other feedback that comes with it. And text can feel a bit cold, but if I say the same thing in the kind of tone that my voice, feedback can go down a bit easier and provide insight into the feedback. And I frequently get messages from students like, thank you. Thank you. I really understand where you're coming from. That was very helpful. So there's lots of other ways to establish connection with students in synchronous or on asynchronous courses. I think one of the best ways is asking some of the meaningful questions. So there's ways to take any discussion question and perhaps make it a little bit more personal. So the psychological contract is one of the topics that we cover in the course on leadership. This unwritten subjective dynamic that exists between an employer and employee. I could just ask them to, describe the describe the psychological contract, but I asked them to talk about where they may have seen breaches of the psychological contract in their work life. And these tales of woe and misery are heartbreaking. Like students talk about sad lunchrooms, they talk about office space and flair, they talk about being cogs in the wheel of bureaucratic madness, but they also talk about really good experiences. And anyway, these tales of woe and heartbreak give them opportunities to build community and connection, and they give us an opportunity to really think about organizational dynamics and what their experiences have been through. So they brought their whole person to work, and I get a chance to see and respond to that whole person in new ways. Does that? I hope that helps a little bit.
I think so, and I know it's an area that a lot of faculty have been concerned about, and your advice is helpful. You also argue that in the rapid transition to online learning because of the pandemic, um, uh, that this transition was one of the factors that resulted in low quality. But you also talk about the fact that many people believe that online learning is cheaper than classroom learning, but you argue that high quality online learning, you've perhaps given some examples of that in your last response. But that, it takes time. There are resources required, and it's not cheap. So, what do you consider the main requirements or resources to be for high quality online education? And what would you have to say about the time and effort that is needed from the faculty?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, Peter. I think the first thing I want to do is that, you know, online education has to be freely chosen. There has to be a level of autonomy. That didn't happen in the pandemic. I think that this level of autonomy, freedom, and choice that didn't exist with the pandemic, I think that that has to be a precursor to thinking about one of the requirements. It has to be something that is chosen rather than thrust upon us. But then, before I comment on the time and effort needed from faculty, the first thing I want to do is add my little bit to quash the idea that online education is cheaper. And this online education is cheaper comes from the desire for scalability. And I think we need to take a look at that. So beyond instructor costs in an online environment, there also needs to be licenses for a lot of things we take for granted. Zoom, Collaborate, in this case, WebEx. I don't exactly know how much University of Waterloo is paying for WebEx, but I know what it would have costed us when we were looking at alternatives. It's not cheap. These tools cost money. So there's the people cost, but then there's the technological infrastructure cost. And these costs are frequently higher. So just taking a look at people plus technology, those things are higher. But then there's also the process of designing the course. I'm pretty sure that the first year that I designed the course, the 5 years ago, the first time I taught the course at the U of A, when I designed it, spent 3 months designing it and doing all those things. I'm pretty sure that by the end I made maybe $1 an hour. Like it took a lot. So the perception that online can be cheaper comes from the word scale, and I think we need to think about the twin dynamics that are still at play, even though they've been operating for so long that we take their influence and operation for granted. And the first of these dynamics is massification. Over the past 50 years, the share of jobs requiring at least some college education has increased from 28 to 60%, and it's only going to go up. Students are going to require, 65% of all jobs in the United States by 2025 will require some form of post-secondary education or training. And the fastest growing sectors of that economy will be those that in the skilled trades. And technology is driving this transformation. So technology will render some jobs obsolete. You talked about the future of work. It will render some jobs obsolete, and there's lots of things out there like the World Economic Forum, Oxford's done a list. But at the same time, it creates new jobs or modifies new jobs, and 40% of these new jobs will be in the skilled trades and technology in some form or fashion. So massification, higher education institutions need to operate at a level of scale that they've never had to operate before. And teaching is a labor intensive process. But the growth of demand has not always been matched by growing public investment. So the pressure of massification has been accompanied and exacerbated by the shift from publicly funded post-secondary institutions to an increased reliance on individual tuition and student loans. Since 2008, so this is not ancient history. The main change in funding is that government income has stagnated or even reversed in real terms, while income from students has continued to increase. So the stagnation of public funding for a post-secondary education is reflective of a cultural shift characterized by the collapse of the social compact between society and higher education, and the narrowing view of higher education as a solely private good. So increased demand, coupled with stagnant public funding and student-borne tuition, have led institutions to implement measures that serve more learners while controlling costs. So the dream of online learning is that it can provide scale, the only solution for serving more learners with decreasing public funding. And if you have to put you forward your money, I mean, students are rightfully concerned about some of the sticker shock and walking out of their institutions with significant amounts of student loan debt. Like this is a real concern for them. And so Ursula Franklin, she wrote The Real World of Technology. She made this observation about scale, that the quest for scalability has transformed scale from being a measure of comparison, that this is bigger than that, to a figure of merit, that scalability expresses an ideology that bigger is always better, but bigger is not always, it's not always clear who bigger is better by. And so scale is the idea that things can be achieved more efficiently or more cheaply, and that's a good reason to do things, but it's not the only reason to do things. And so who is bigger better for? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure bigger is always better for students. I'm not sure bigger is always better for faculty. I'm not sure bigger is always better for administrators. That's the challenge that they have to deal with. That's the conundrum that they have to solve. But I'm not sure it's better for the taxpayers themselves. So I think the main requirements for high quality education are not as complicated as some of the more complicated things that precede and rest above online education. I think it includes an awareness and understanding of students that are instruction. I think it understands a clear rationale. Why are we doing online? Graduate programs are the fastest growing sector of online education because students don't want to give up their jobs, they don't want to give up their family, they don't want to give up their houses, and they're learning junkies by this point. They're fairly mature learners. So it's access. It's not necessarily cost savings. Many graduate programs tend to be highly profitable, but it's really that flows from the access argument. I think you also need to have a clear vision. What do you want the online learning experience to be like for your students? What is quality? And then time, preparation, tools, and then finally a commitment to continuous improvement. The last stage of the ADDIE design process is that evaluation, but that continuous improvement, really doing the hard work to think about how we can make micro changes over time that lead to, this aggregation of gains over time that just leads to better and better.
Yeah, what I'm hearing there essentially is that we should very carefully consider the objectives that we have of education and our application of technology, and that cost is perhaps an important part of that, but there are many other things that we need to think about. Okay. The next question I've got follows to some extent from what we've been talking about so far, in that I'm interested to know what you think the support is that faculty need or would be best for faculty to help them with their transition from classroom to online.
It's a really great question, Peter. I'll try to, I'm giving really kind of long answers, and I'm sorry about that, but I've been working on this for a long time, and this opportunity is an incredibly, valuable one to me because you get a chance to, I've got a sympathetic ear to talk about stuff that matters to me. So thank you.
I'm enjoying the answers, so continue.
I think there's lots of good models out there, but I think it starts with exploring the teaching identity. Teaching identity is a complex, it's a multifaceted concept. But my interview with directors of Canadian teaching and learning centers over the past year highlighted that we need to help form the teaching identity and really identify really provide professional development opportunities that target some of the self-limiting beliefs about teaching, in general, and then teaching online specifically. So the formation of a teaching identity takes place over time. Professional development plays an important role in identity development because individuals are shaped by their experiences within the various structures of their teaching activity. And I think that this is perhaps most important at the community college and the polytechnic level. Like I'm at a community college, I'm not at a university, and I'm very aware of the differences. And so I'm going to speak just from my context. And if it's relevant to university setting, then that's great. But many vocational and technical educators actually eschew the term teacher because of their primary professional identity as a practitioner. And we talk about this change. Are you a power engineer? Are you a carpenter? Are you a nurse? Or are you a nurse educator? Are you an educator? Are you a are you so that teaching identity is really important because I think a lot of when people don't have teacher as their primary identity, I think learners lose out a lot. And so I think a lot of professional development needs to start with reckoning with this idea of teaching identity, and then how can that identity be expressed online, which leads to instructional autonomy. Again, carefully negotiated boundaries in the face-to-face environment that are then we need to figure out alternatives or equivalencies in the online environment. And I think instructional autonomy is definitely one of those, and this is connected to unbundling. You know, instructional autonomy is one dimension of the professional teaching identity that allows for and encourages agency within the constraints and contexts that educators operated. So I'll just read this quote because this is what a lack of autonomy can look and feel like when online teaching. So some adjuncts, again, really speaking about part-time faculty, are simply given a textbook and a syllabus and then asked to teach a course in class that they've never taught. This is of course a worst case scenario, but it's one that's repeated at the beginning of every semester on college campuses around the United States. Based on the interviews that I had with directors of teaching and learning centers and based on the best Canadian research available, this worst case scenario takes place across Canada as well. And the lack of preparation may be worse for online instructors. Regular faculty are often given academic freedom that may or may not extend to part-time faculty, especially those who are teaching online. Some have even suggested that the lack of autonomy, you're just given the course, you teach this course. For part-time instructors, just teach the course the way it's designed. That justifies not offering professional development. But within these constraints and contexts, faculty need to be given clear areas where they can exercise their professional identity and creativity within the teaching and learning environment. And nowhere is this more needed than assessments. And I think I talked about assessments. I think I talked about assessments enough, but the big challenge I think going forward too, from now on, is going to be recognizing that we're at a new place. We're going to need professional development to be along a developmental spectrum. The pandemic has intensified and accelerated some things that already existed. Now, more faculty than ever before have built some understanding and some basic competency around online pedagogy. But how do we keep moving on that path towards true proficiency and experiment with new and sophisticated forms of instruction that are actually more effective than what we're doing? So we're still going to need to be doing that basic, like here's some basic forms of instruction that are more effective than others, but how do we move? And then finally, I would say that all of this needs to take place within a community of learners, which can be as difficult to establish for faculty as it can be for students, maybe even more so. But if we take social learning theory seriously, social learning theory suggests that learning is grounded in relationships. And one institution I interviewed that invested heavily in online learning took building community seriously by assigning all new faculty a mentor to combat faculty isolation. And that was really important. So a formal mentorship plan ensured that faculty are supported, that they didn't suffer isolation, and institutions that don't provide mentoring, institutions that don't take steps to meaningfully integrate online faculty into a community, well, they send the message that they don't deserve the investment and institutional effort. So I think, how do we start? We've got to talk about the teaching identity. We've got to figure out where people can exercise autonomy, especially with assessments, and recognize that people are on a developmental spectrum with their comfort in teaching online, and then do this within a community. And so when I put all those together, you realize that that's going to be a significant challenge going forward.
But what it does highlight is the extent, I guess, of the change which is required to make this move from classroom to online. It's not simply a case of saying, okay, you're going to do your course online now, as happened in many institutions. partly by necessity as a result of the pandemic, but that, properly organized, that transition is something that requires attention to a number of areas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just being able to use the learning management system, just being able to use WebEx, like that's kind of a baseline, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I was also interested in what you had to say there about autonomy and at the same time, new, pedagogical development and the desire to establish new forms or forms of good online learning, but at the same time, by not overly constraining, enabling autonomy for the instructors or teachers or whatever we call them, but that how that is all managed does seem to be very important, and you drew attention to that.
My great fear for online learning, Peter, my great fear for online learning is that it will start to calcify, that it will start to become like this is how it's done, that it will become very formulaic, kind of a recipe, and it'll lose some of the kind of innovation and excitement that it's really characterized the last couple decades. That there will become like this is the way to do it kind of thing.
Which also, I mean, given the pace of technological change and the rapidly increasing range of capabilities that are developing, we want to be able to experiment. Okay, the next question I've got, just a few more. Thank you for your time so far, but you talked about the more, I guess, disadvantaged sections of society who were more likely to struggle more with online learning. And I guess it should be broader than disadvantaged sections, but some sections of society, some areas of the population are thought to be more likely to do well online than others. And you referred to that, and I was keen on your advice around that too. What should be done?
Yeah, I don't want to punt on this one, but of all the questions you asked, this is the one that I really wish I could answer. There are so many structural inequalities. And I love the way that Carnevale put it. He wrote this great article on, democracy and capitalism and education's role. And what he said is that education is both an equalizer of opportunity and a bastion of privilege. And so it can help narrow the gaps, but it can also help widen the gaps. And I fear that what will happen is that it will widen the gap. And we're starting to see that a little bit, again, just relying on really stuff that's just coming out now within the last couple days. As in the broader society, the pandemic disproportionately affected lower income and minority communities. Community colleges, which often serve those populations like I work in, we saw enrollments drop steeply. So I think ours was 4.5%, whereas many four-year institutions lost relatively few students. So there's this gap between the kind of, not to point it out, but there's a gap between the University of Waterloo's and the Medicine Hat colleges, right? There's a very real gap between those two things. And that's important, and so what can be done about these inequities, I'm not really sure. Again, I really wish I could answer this one. There are some promising developments. So kind of like I'm worried that there will be, an exacerbation of some of these gaps, but there are some promising developments. The pandemic has accelerated the conversation about disability accommodations. Up until this year, I've read so many articles about faculty who just did not want to record their lectures for students with disabilities. They just really did not want to do that. Well, now recording your lectures has become a standard expectation, and many faculty have been converted. Like they see real value in doing so. And so this is one area where I think that there is a shift that's being considered. What will the new normal be? Because the old normal wasn't particularly desirable for some students with disabilities. And so the new normal might be a way. So I think inclusive design can help in this regard, and then some institutions, and what I pointed out in the article, and I don't know who will figure this out, but I know someone will. Some institutions are working very hard to create a really strong continuum of care between the teaching and learning environment and student supports. How do we identify students that are struggling with their mental health, and how do we connect them with the right supports? Because faculty can't do that. That's it's not their background, probably not their role, but there are people that we invest in, and how do we connect them? I think learning analytics can solve. I don't think learning analytics can solve this problem, but I think it can help. I think analytics, well used early alert systems, well used dashboards, like there's lots of good examples out there. I think they can be helpful in establishing meaningful connections to the student supports when students need them, so that they can be successful. And I think for those students that are called the new majority of students, those students that, again, mature students, lower levels of academic preparation, students of color, first generation students, all of those students that are coming in, I think that that's going to be one area. So really thinking about interactive instructional designs that are engaging for them, but really connecting them with the student supports. And yeah, lots of people are doing work in this area, but again, I wish I could answer this one better.
You took some good steps towards it, and I think the answer was good anyway. But the institutional constraints in online learning in universities and colleges, the things that may be restricting the extent of online learning there. You talked about those, I think, and I was interested in what you had to say there.
I think it dovetails from a couple different questions. The last one, and then when I was talking about massification and scalability, I'd like to go back to something Alex Usher recently said and ponder over it a little bit. He says nationally we're talking about 200 to 400,000 students who might be more open to making remote education a permanent part of their education. Okay. But then he says such a move would not be easy, and it might not be possible for all universities, smaller ones who would lack capital resources, or prestigious ones that might not want to be seen diluting their brand. But if one or two of them make the right investments, the rewards are potentially very, very high. But what I wanted to ponder on that is, smaller institutions are going to find it more difficult to participate and grow their online learning opportunities. Online education has already been unevenly distributed in Canada, and Dr. Laurie Harrison from the University of Toronto, she did a really masterful job, I think, in mapping these inequalities out in the Ontario e-learning policy scape. With increasing competition, the demographic changes that are happening, the technological changes that are happening in the work environment, performance-based funding models are going to be constraints. Stagnant funding are going to be constraints. The increased investment in online education is all going to lead to, I think, a more unevenly distributed online learning landscape with some severe consequences, I believe, for some smaller communities and their institutions that are going to find themselves perhaps not able to get into the marketplace or squeezed out by larger competitors. So I think all of these are going to be real constraints, and I don't want to take the easy answer, but I do think funding will remain the biggest constraint, because it forces institutions into a certain number of actions that they wouldn't be forced into. And so some of those institutions that may have endowments or other resources, I think that they'll be able to perhaps innovate and be creative in ways that other smaller institutions can't.
So within those constraints, to what extent do you think online learning will feature more in conventional institutions after the pandemic? And what should they be doing now to prepare for that?
Yeah. In my interviews with directors over the past year, I think this comment really highlights it all. The many tools like Padlet, Kahoot, etc., are now part of a faculty's repertoire. And while instruction may not be fully online, I anticipate more variation in instruction with these new tools seeded throughout. And I think that this confirms what Tony Bates has been saying, that the future will be blended. And we need to learn to think in blended. I really hope one of the things that comes out of the pandemic is a final, complete, total end to the unproductive debate about face-to-face and online. Like, I hope that really disappears. And online has now moved to the center rather than on the periphery. And what needs to be thought about, I think, is what needs to be thought about intentionally is what are we blending? Are we blending what and why are we blending it? Are we blending in person, online? Are we blending synchronous, asynchronous? Why does it need to be blended that way? How is this better for the student? And if institutions can really come to a conclusion that, hey, you know what, this professional development over the past year has really actually had an impact, a really positive impact for students. I mean, what happened was very bad, but it could have been a lot worse without teaching and learning centers. Could have been a lot worse. The situation could have been much, much worse. Well, maybe we need to invest in that, and maybe we need to start thinking about things in a very different way. We're trying to interact in a very dynamic and fast changing environment, and the terminology has always been a barrier, I think, to the reality of what's happening. And in our book, Online Assessments, assessments in online contexts, I think we make the argument that terms blended, online, face to face, are going to become meaningless to some extent. They're still going to be useful for talking things, but they're largely meaningful. Like right now, are we face to face? Are we online? We're both. And so how does this become? And this is why I think so what do they need to do to prepare right now is just really engage in what I think is happening, which is a pedagogical renaissance. And what I mean by that is that so many people have tried to prove that online was good, and then all of these other people were trying to prove that online was bad. And that mixture, especially over the past year, that mixture has created this kind of thing like, hey, what is this teaching all about? And how can we do this more effectively for students? And if they embrace that, you know, then the conventional institution, I think, will be permanently changed after this. And that's, I think they're already doing it. I think many teaching and learning centers, I know all of them are already working on this.
So how can we learn from the past year in order to do things better in the future? Likely using more technology to do that.
Using more technology, but putting the human first. Putting the human first. One of the things that there's this quote that I have, and I won't get it right, from Randy Bass, but he says that we're at a moment of convergence. And he wrote this before the pandemic, but I think that this convergence really happened over the past year. And he calls it a second, more mature wave of work that transcends techno solutionism. So we're not focusing on the technology. We're so comfortable with technology. Technology is just there. And Ursula Franklin talks about technology as the fish and the water, the icing and the cake. It's not something that's separate from us, but technology is not going to have the techno solutionism. We have to see past the ideology of technology to get to this, what Bass calls an integrative vision that's committed to student success and deep learning, that again starts to rebuild that social compact. And I know that this is kind of like high, dreamy, pie in the sky, idealistic stuff, but we've got to put the future of human capacity first. And I think what has been, and this came up in a lot of the interviews when I was working with the directors of teaching and learning centers, that technology often came in the way of pedagogy. Instructors were figuring out, like, how do I use the LMS, not why, or how do I use the LMS to do certain things, but why am I using the LMS to do certain things? And so the technology became a barrier to the pedagogy. And once we put that human capacity, once we put that human first, once we put technology at the service of humans, rather than, I think we've had it backwards for a while, and definitely, I think that's one of the main things that we can learn from the pandemic, like putting the people first, rather than the technology.
Absolutely. Okay, my final question. The people who are going to be watching this will be moving forward with their careers. Some of them, as students, will be moving on to their employment. Faculty may be moving on to the teaching they're going to do in the future. Have you got any final words that you would have for them about their participation in and maybe contribution to education in the future?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd give, the one thing I'd suggest is just pick up and read Ursula Franklin's The Real World of Technology. I think it's fantastic. I've used it and I've really pursued her work a great deal. I think it's vital to understanding how technology is changing teaching from a holistic technology, where the teacher as an artisan was in control of the process from beginning to end, to a prescriptive technology, and the social costs and implications of unbundling, some of which will be positive and some of which will be negative. And we need to be able to filter out the positives from the negatives. And so Ursula Franklin says that she's long subscribed to the earthworm theory of social change. Social change, she says, will not come down to us like an avalanche down from the mountain. It'll come through seeds growing in well prepared soil, and it is we, like the earthworms, who prepare the soil. And what I take away from that is that it's dirty work. It's dirty work. It's underground and it's largely invisible, but it's vital. So for students, I think it's important to understand the invisible architecture of education and the ideology of technology and how that impacts how you think and how you experience reality. And students, you have an interest in your faculty's economic lives, whether you know it or not. You have an interest in their working conditions. And for faculty, I think it's the difficult work of continuing to organize, represent part-time faculty, but it's also, again, making sure that that technology serves a human purpose. And I think if we can keep that focus on human capacity, then we have a chance to mature online education so that it fulfills its potential and its promise, and it actually serves those people who need it most.
Jason, I'm really grateful to you for talking to me today. I found what you've had to say fascinating, and I'm going to be watching all of it again, more than once, I expect, because there are so many things there that are that are worth taking time to consider and to think about. So, thank you very much for what you've had to say.
Thank you. I hope it was useful. Thank you for the generosity of your ears. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of the things I've been thinking about lately.